This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hi, I'm Valerie Johnson from the National Archives. I wanted to ask all the speakers actually if they could comment on the issue of ownership. It came up in all the presentations we've heard this morning. So for Sujit, for example, obviously there was that fantastic instance of you buying the postcards and that becoming part of your personal archive, which then informed your history in conjunction with the RCS archive. And Catherine was talking about how you asked the communities to lead the project so that the archives became in some sense owned by them, and then the projects became owned by them. And in Mike's particular case, it seemed that with the digitisation, people can access history and kind of download it in many cases, so that they can put it in and mix it, as Sujit did, into part of their own personal archive, and that affects the way they view the archive and the way they view the history. So I wondered if people could comment on that, and also, if you can, and I know none of you are archivists because you all apologised at the beginning, if you think that issue should affect the way archivists curate archives.
Well, I'm working currently... Sorry, do I need a mic? Yep. Oh, there's one here. Okay. I'm currently working with an academic who's based in Berlin, where there's the biggest Cameroonian community outside the Cameroon. And we have fantastic photograph collections from the Cameroonian grasslands, in the Dalrymple collection. And he's curating an exhibition there with the Cameroonian community. We've also sent digital copies of all those Cameroonian photographs out to the Cameroon. Professor Fanso, a historian of Cameroon, is working with them there. And we're working with David Zeitlin, an anthropologist in Oxford, on the same collection. So, yes, they are owned very much, in a sense, by the Cameroonian community. And I'm really glad that they are out there and being researched and discussed with the community. That's just one example.
Yeah, and I suppose, in a sense, when we were preparing this, we were wondering about the ethical kind of, sort of, these are colonial archives, what does that mean ethically at the moment? And in a sense, that sort of picks up something I was trying to stress, which is that there are gaps in the documents and the sources that we have, and one way of addressing that would be then to sort of make some sort of relationship with the communities, with the places that these sources are about. That's not something I do myself, and it has to be a collaborative enterprise between different types of archivists, curators, and scholars, I guess. So just in terms of the material that I was talking about, there's lots of work that could be done with, say, the plantation communities of Sri Lanka. There's lots of anthropological work on that, and it would be quite fascinating to know then, in a sense, how they respond to the photographs. Someone like Chris Pinney actually kind of takes photographs out into the field and shows them to the people and gets their response, and that would be really fascinating, I guess. So it's those sorts of projects that sort of, in a sense, yes, recognize that these artifacts and objects are owned and are being bought and so forth online, but yet how do we do more than that by building some sort of relationship between our collections, both in institutions and in terms of knowledge, and the people in Asia, for instance, in Sri Lanka in particular, for this presentation.
Wait for the sound to start again. One of the things I probably didn't say quite as clearly as I could in the presentation was why the materials were so important, the comment that had been made about the kind of the authenticity and the response you get when you see the original materials that was made in the first presentation. One of the critical parts about the workshops as part of the Crossing Continents project was that the participants themselves also brought in some of their own materials that represented their own personal histories. And that often was the stimulus for the discussions and the workshops that then extended into the materials that the society holds that sits around that. So in terms of the materials that were at the foundation of that project, it very much was shared in terms of those materials, those kind of histories, the artifacts associated with them. So I think that's a very important element that we thought that we wanted to bring in, and that's a theme that we've continued in a lot of the subsequent work we've done in terms of working with different community groups. I think there's some interesting points there about the kind of the global histories and the local interpretations, etc., even though if it's playing out in London. I think there's a second set of really interesting questions. When you enter into these types of partnerships and collaborations, which is also a point that I was trying to make about where you look for expertise and kind of the collective expertise, looking to the academic community, looking to curatorial and archival staff, but also looking to community groups. We've talked a lot about the crowdsourcing, whether that's done digitally or whether it's done in a much smaller group, actually in a workshop. And I think there are some really interesting questions then about the intellectual property that's associated with that, how it's used, some real sensitivities, as we've all talked about and skirted around, in terms of the kind of materials that sit in our collections and what they mean in 21st century world. So I think I don't have any answers, but I think it's a really interesting question that we should be thinking much more about.
I think I've got two observations on that. The first is general, and the second relates to business archives. Generally, I think if you put something online, you're accepting that you're going to lose control of it. Okay, you can copy, you can watermark it, and do all of that sort of stuff, but I think you have to accept that you are going to lose some ownership of that document. And I think related to that, actually, it highlights the fact that it's the records that are important, not the institutions. So whilst you can view a lot of this stuff in terms of archives are held in the TNA or in the LMA or whatever, actually what I want to encourage is people to use records and not really think about what institution they're in, just use the records. So in that sense, ownership doesn't matter. You just need people to facilitate making those records available. Of course, there is a particular problem for businesses because, of course, they don't like actually losing control of things, particularly their sort of what they might see as their intellectual property. So that's quite hard. And then the other thing is that in terms of use, the way a lot of businesses use their records is precisely to assert the importance of that in their ownership and the fact it relates specifically to that business. It's not to actually just be democratic about it. And then, of course, the other issue is as well that a lot of businesses in their history have got things that they don't really want people to know about. So obviously making it open and sort of in effect letting go of ownership does have risks in terms of reputation. And I know personally and from other archivists I know who work in businesses, this is the sort of thing that gives the legal department an absolute headache. But overall, I mean, I think you've just got, even for businesses though, once it's online, once it's out there, you're not going to stop it. You just need to look at the way that photographs, documents get bounced around Twitter to know that you've effectively lost control of it.
Thank you. Maxine, you had a question.
Well, I'd like to ask all of you comment on to what extent what you're talking about is about a global archive or global history, or are we still in the frameworks of imperial or new imperial history? Sujit's paper it's very interesting, and I was fascinated by these lines that left out the native fish vessels, trading and fishing vessels, etc., and the Indian indentured laborers. But what about all the other people of the world who were in these spaces? What I'm asking about, what it comments on really, is there's an extent to which we've lost those connections with the rest of Europe that in kind of historiography that has made this turn to global history, we're working intensively on those connections with our own colonial pasts individually across Europe and in comparison, etc. But how much are we really seriously engaging in those wider connections? And that's just with Europe. And I just want to carry that on with Michael Anson's talk. I'm very interested in that you're the chair of the Business Archives Council. I think it was founded, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 1930s and was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which was then in a big enterprise of funding all kinds of academic and library, museum-related sources, etc., on a big European-wide venture at that time. And it's just interesting that America doesn't feature in this story. That's just chopped off to a separate historiography. So, there it is. Okay.
Shall I just go first on that? Actually, the Business Archives Council is 80 years old this year. It was founded in 1934. So you're right about that. Alas, there is no Rockefeller money behind the... I'd like to be able to say there was, but we haven't got any money from the Rockefellers. It all had its origins in the London School of Economics and a group of businessmen who got together to form it. But I mean, I agree with that. On your more general point, well, I think at the moment where it's still in a period where actually these developments are allowing existing forms of history to be done more easily. I'm not sure it's particularly led to other developments. And from my own viewpoint as well, most of the users of our documents are not actually academics who are at the sort of cutting edge of developing new forms or writing about global history. They're actually the mainstream for archives, which is family history and general researchers. And that's what's actually driving, in my view, a lot of the development of the global archive is that wider interest in history and not so much coming up with new historiography in global history. I mean, that's obviously a spin-off, and I think that actually arises from that, but I think the main driver is in more traditional forms of historical pursuit or research.
Thank you, Maxine. I'm going to have to speak to you later because I'm not sure I've got the question 100%, but if the question is about other European connections into Colombo, yes, there are other European connections. So what in relation to mail, steamers, and things like this. But actually the British sort of route into Colombo really dominates the story in terms of mail or ships and so on in this period. So yes, one could kind of open it up in all those other ways in relation to European connectivity. So that might be what you were asking about. I guess more generally the point I'm making here is that if one wants to do connected history, this is the most connected one could get in some ways in 1900. This is the place, the point, quite physically, where connection's happening, the breakwater. But when one looks at that node of connection, there's disconnection, right? Where things don't sort of happen side by side, where things happen in different sort of worlds, as it were. And so I think perhaps the point I'm making is that we need to move beyond connectivity and connected histories and lines that stretch in different directions to look in quite specific ways at the limits of connection and the importance of particular places and localities, even just a harbour like this. So that's the sort of broader point I'm making. But of course, yes, one could write a whole range of connected histories, indentured labour, across the Indian Ocean, European trans-imperial sort of networks coming in here, merchants, intellectuals, etc., working together on the development of the port and so on. So there are lots of connected histories which can quite compellingly be told about this place. But I'm just sort of saying that maybe that's not the whole story.
I'm not a historian, but again, there are very good connections between librarians and archivists across Europe. They're not just much more international. For example, I'm very involved with the South Asian Archive and Library Group and Southeast Asian Library Group. And we have librarians from France and Denmark coming to our meetings, and from Holland and Belgium. We are much broader than it might imply. And as I said with the RCS archives, they are very international and include a lot of other European countries, former colonies in the collection, so there are lots of interconnections there.
I don't think I have anything really much more to add. I think there are others in the room who can talk much more authoritatively about how the types of collections we've all talked about are stimulating and informing some of those new discussions and debates, and I'd certainly turn to them in the room. I think it is interesting that one of the themes that came out from our presentations which were focusing quite extensively on public access and activities was with the collections was the kind of the idea about people living global lives and drawing on local histories through these repositories that are sitting here in London. But in terms of your broader point, I think there are others in the room who can speak much more authoritatively to that.
There's another question. Partway back there.
Thank you. I have a question specifically for Catherine Souch, but it can then perhaps be extended. I was enormously impressed by your account of the project with school children from different immigrant groups. And my question was, first of all, does it go on now? They have teaching packs. Do they still come to the RGS? That was one specific question. One of the things that worries me, and I don't know if other people here share my concern, is that funding of archives at the moment depends on whizzy projects, and they are terrific. But so you have money for a specific thing for 3 years, and then it's gone, and then you have to have another whizzo project. And, you know, the kind of support you really want for all your ongoing work isn't there. So the two questions go together.
You've hit the nail on the head, haven't you? In terms of the first question, in terms of do school groups still come to the society? Yes, they do. To the extent that they were able to with the resources when you have project funding and you can provide lunches and you can provide transportation, the honest answer is no. But that's where the second point that I was trying to make in my presentation I think is much more important, which is having done these projects, they have, I think, shifted the way we as an organisation work and the elements that we think are important. So, for example, the project that was led by Felix on Hidden Histories of Exploration, integral to that were two of the elements that came out of the Crossing Continents project, one of which was drawing in community expertise and insights, and the second one of which was developing curriculum-ready resources that could be used as one of the legacies of the project. So I think your general point is absolutely right in the sense of in any organisation, unfortunately, we're always what dominates this project-funded work that is whizzy and bangy, and we can do the latest thing with it. But I think what's really important is for institutions in terms of their own legacy, as well as the materials that might sit on websites or in whatever form, is to think about how we embed that then in our programme of work going forward. So curriculum resources absolutely are at the core now of any exhibition we do. They may not be quite as innovative, have quite so much technology associated with it, but we always try and have that as an element. We are quite lucky as an organisation that we do have a schools team well, we're a small organisation, but we do have a schools team who then take that and they embed it in teachers' professional development networks in terms of seminar courses that we have in the early evening for teachers to come and actually encourage them using them, because of course there's a big step between putting your stuff online and then actually getting it used. So I think it's a really important point about legacy and continuity.
I didn't quite answer your question, but I've just got an observation about funding, which is that to some extent I think funding and the money that comes from funding bodies for cataloguing, curation of archival material actually reinforces the local use of records. So you might have an important collection where you say, oh, this firm was part of the workshop of the world. You use that to, in effect, assert the importance of your collection. But then, in fact, how that's then going to be presented in your local museum or archive is going to very much connect with the local community, even if those archives could potentially be used globally. And I think funding bodies are actually very much looking towards how you fit in with that local community as well, whether it's local authority, HLF or whatever. I think then if you put together a funding application that said this is going to create links across the world, well, okay, that's a sort of nice thing to say, but actually you want to connect with former workers or people who live in that area, get local schools involved. So the global element's being used as a hook, but I don't think it's actually being used to develop local history in that way.
Any other questions? Yes.
Michael Anson just pointed to the fact that digitisation had made significant changes in the relationship between archivists and users. I'm a historian, and I'd be very interested in any comments on that.
Okay, I'm sure other people have got a view as well, but well, I think there's a couple of observations. One is that of the obvious point that you don't actually meet your users, and for business archives, and I mean, I can't really speak for other areas, but one of the things about business archives and their specialist nature is that the interaction between the user and the researcher, which can work both ways, by the way, because the researcher can actually inform your collection if it's quite a technical one. The interaction between the personal interaction between the user and the archivist is very important, and obviously that's being eroded in some sense, that doesn't exist. On the other hand, social media actually allows you to develop in completely different ways. So I've now got through Twitter interactions with hundreds of people who I've never met before across the world talking about use of archives and business archives. Now, okay, that's not quite the same as the one-to-one interaction, but nevertheless, it can create something else. So it does change the nature of it. And I think the other thing is that actually it leads to a view on the behalf of a lot of researchers that, in fact, and it's slightly contradicting Clem's point, because I think his point about actually seeing the archive is very important, but I think a lot of users just see the archives as information. And digital cameras, I see users come in, they just photograph away, they hardly talk to us, they set the camera up on the stand, click, 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 click. So that's changed as well. So it's actually the relationship between the user and the archivist is changed because of that, and I think actually that it's also ties in with the way that actually the way people view the information and archives has changed. So actually a lot of users probably don't think it matters that they don't come and talk to their archivist, as long as it's available somewhere as information. So those are really the two aspects, but I don't know if other people have got.
Gosh, sorry, I've been stuck in front of me. Anyone want to go first? No?
Okay, I mean, just, oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege and jump in here. I used to work at the British Museum, and I'm now at the British Library. And I think just following on from that interaction with archivists point, one thing that I've noticed in both places is sometimes a tendency for people to think it's not either in the online catalogue or digitised, and they sort of assume it doesn't exist. And so without that engagement with the archivists, it's a much more serious problem of stuff kind of getting orphaned and ending up in the dark.
Yeah, just to sort of add to that, I mean, I sort of totally agree with what was said earlier by Clem. In a sense, the point I was trying to make as well was that it can be quite easy to do things online and to miss things out totally. So actually just sort of, there's a danger that at the present moment, maybe it'll change, I don't know, 20, 40 years down the line, that certain things are online and certain things are not online, and one just sort of does one's research only with the sort of easily available things. And I think especially for global histories or transnational histories, it's important really to try and bring things together from different places, and also to visit these places actually. I mean, this is something I tell the students who kind of are starting global history projects, just go to the places and visit the place and spend time there, meet the people, etc. And I think that sort of matters for the sources as well, in a sense, having a sort of meeting with the sources across different places. So I think it's, we haven't sort of, I don't think the digitization sort of moment has provided the whole answer yet. Maybe it will sometime in the future, in the distant future, but at the moment I think it's really important to do more than it, and also to be rather critical about what it's allowing us to do.
Yes, I agree with those points. As I think I mentioned in my talk, vast quantities of the RCS collection are hidden from the digital world. But also I wanted to mention one other thing. I still get lots of people who ring me up, who write me letters. Not everybody uses a computer, certainly uses the RCS collections. I've got about 20% of my users write long letters. And I mean long, they can be 10 pages, handwritten script. It takes me longer to read them than an email. But they also expect me to take longer to reply, which is actually quite good, because you can't always just reply to an email. It takes a lot of research and thinking. I have people who phone me, especially older people, you know, they can't write very well now. Their hand's shaky, whatever the reason, they can't get out. But they actually still enjoy talking to me and talking about the collections and how I can help them with their research. And it is often family research at the centre of it, but it expands across the world. So I don't think we should forget those people. It's not just that vast amounts of our collections aren't yet digital, perhaps will never be digital. You know, it might be just one archive in the RCS, but it's 100 boxes or more. When am I ever going to get the funds or the volunteers to do all the digitizing? And if you don't have the right metadata descriptions with it, it's useless out there. So I think what we do need to just stop and think about these people who don't necessarily want something digital. There's a much bigger world. And I enjoy talking to groups. We have groups of students come in from different universities. We have other groups from members of the public who come in and talk. And I talked a bit about how we have this amazing archive from Changi, the civilian internment camp on Singapore from the Second World War. And members of the public who have families there, they're very interested in that, and they want to come and talk about the archive. We're hoping to work with that group because the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire have got a museum and they're wanting to put more and more material in. I'm hoping we can work with them on that. But again, they want you to go to meetings, talk to people face to face. So I think there's a lot more than just digital to global history.
Gentleman in the red jumper, further back, and then there's
Mine is a very general question. Can you think of any justification for concealing records from the public or interested communities? And I'm not thinking of the Mau Mau records at the moment, but that could be an example.
I didn't get the question.
Is there any justification that you can think of for concealing records from people, perhaps including communities engaged?
I don't think so, and I actually disagree with Michael a little bit in terms of losing control. I think losing control is a good thing, actually. That's what it should be, because... Okay, businesses think that. Right, fine, sorry, I'll distinguish you from businesses. But I think, surely, for historians as well as archivists, it's about having people read this stuff and make their own minds up about it and use it in different ways. So I think losing control and revealing and etc. is great, and more the better, please. Yeah.
Just agree, actually. We do have Mau Mau photos, absolutely horrendous, chopped up bodies, photographs, and we've described them. They've been described in our online catalogues all the time I've been there. So we haven't hidden it. We haven't actually digitized those yet, but then we haven't digitized vast other quantities of material. So no, we're not trying to hide anything, to my knowledge. We haven't yet got everything out there in terms of digital cataloguing, just because we haven't had the resources to do it. But we're not censoring that material in any way.
Just to reiterate. Actually, I completely agree with openness, but with my business historian's hat on, it is subject to two caveats. One is, of course, data protection, and the other thing is freedom of information. So if you work in a bank archive, then you necessarily have to think about the fact that you have customer accounts, for example, and things like that. So there are often reasons why things can't be open. But if it's just because of some sensitivity that the institution doesn't want to be found out about, then I disagree with that. So really, within the sort of confines of what the legislation entails that you have to do, I am actually for openness. But it's fair to say that lots of businesses do not take that view.
I'm Peter Mandler from the Royal Historical Society, and I think this is probably the same question that Maxine asked, but slightly from a different angle and aimed more specifically at the archivists. So the Royal Historical Society has spent a lot of time recently engaging with Michael Gove's proposals for the national curriculum, GCSEs and A-levels. And one of the arguments that we've been making is that children should be exposed to the whole of the world's history. And that means not only British history, but it also means world history beyond the points where the world connects with Britain. So that Michael Gove's initial proposals said, well, we should study Ireland when the British conquer it, and India when the British conquer it, and then possibly the Caribbean when the Caribbeans come to Britain. And we said, well, actually, no, we would like to see people exposed to, as I say, all sorts of world histories where Britain doesn't really feature at all. And I'm happy to say that the exam boards are now at work on curricula on, for example, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, early modern China. It won't go very far, but we've made some progress. And as an historian, I think that's all to the good. And I'm also sure that there is lots of material in British archives that is not related either to the British Empire or indeed to diasporic communities, which are, of course, part of your constituency and who you're serving. But my question really is, could the archivists in particular, Sujit may well indeed have something to say to this as well, talk a little bit about where you think are some underexplored and underused elements of your archives, underexplored and underused precisely because they don't have a constituency in the UK, either an Anglo one or a diasporic one.
I'm still thinking about it.
I'll give a very short and not very adequate answer, with the caveat, of course, I'm not an archivist. I mean, I think it is a challenge, isn't it, in the sense of, it comes back to a point that was made before, which is in an organisation such as the RGS, a lot of the work that we're able to do is the work that is supported by projects. And those projects often have a very British element to them. It's focused on the UK, or it's Britain's abroad. But many of the materials, of course, that the Society holds, any of these organisations hold, have an awful lot to say about the people, the places, the environments, in many distant places, independent of that British connection. I'm thinking in my mind, I've got some of the film that I saw for the first time as part of the Hidden Histories of Exploration, in terms of images. Yes, they were taken by British climbers going to the Himalayas, but the films themselves have enormous amount to say about northern India, Tibet, China, in terms of some of the early images. So I think, unfortunately, because the hook of kind of how we tell the stories and how we display them is often driven by the point made before, which is tied to funding, some of those elements aren't brought out. But I absolutely, strongly support your position, as we do in the Royal Geographical Society with Mr. Gove, around the importance of studying not just that British connection, but elsewhere as well.
Oh, well, the material in the RCS collections is broader, as I've said, and as people travelled, they travelled through countries that had nothing to do with Britain to get to somewhere else that might have had something to do with Britain. And so, you're looking at some of Tim's films, for example, he filmed in Algeria, he filmed in Belgium, he filmed elsewhere in Britain. It's just, it could be anywhere. It doesn't have to be necessarily part of the former British Empire that the collections encompass. And that's the same throughout our photograph collections, which I'm perhaps more familiar with than all the written archives. But I don't know if Sujit wants to add anything to that.
And I think it's a very good question, and I think people should think about it, and we should all think about it. I guess something that I could sort of contribute very small into the discussion is that actually there are certain places in the British Empire that dominate as well. So it's partly about kind of using these collections. Sorry, I would say this one time. Not to talk about India, not to talk about certain places which have dominated the story. So there's that element to it. It's a very small thing, but I think that the question is much bigger than that.
So thinking about it, actually the first point is that if you're going to fund access, it's quite difficult to put together a case to fund access to something that has no link to your business, if it's a business archive. So you might say, we're going to say digitize or make these records available, put on an exhibition about this because the company was based here or worked there. But it'd be quite hard, I think, for a funding body to say, we're going to fund an exercise where, in fact, there's no link with any of the British Empire or colonial at all. I mean, it'd be very magnanimous if they did, but the realistic the way funding works, I don't know if that would happen. The other thing is, in terms of business archives, the collections policies of most business archives reflects the activity of the business and its operations across the world, say. So it's very unlikely that businesses have much material that, in fact, don't reflect the areas where they were where they operated. But there's a lot that can be done by lateral thinking. So I think there's lots of scope for using sources in ways that can actually tell you a lot more about countries other than the fact that that business did activity in that country. But obviously that needs a bit more work.
Thank you very much. My name is Naoko Shimazu from Birkbeck College, University of London. I'm interested in the sources of funding. I know about, the UK Research Council type fundings, but what other sources of fundings do you tend to get? Because I was just wondering that maybe from what many of you have been saying, a lot of sort of digitization and programs to make more available, the sources that you have are connected with funding, and that us historian academics, we do seek funding also. That if there's more of a kind of collaboration between the kind of sources that we look at and the archives, the principal archives that we use, perhaps there could be, means of sort of making these materials more available. So would you sort of tell us a bit more about the sources of funding which are not obvious?
Okay, so in the case of business archives, I'm really talking about corporate archives here. Most of the funding for running those archives is coming from the business. It's coming internally. It is not coming from external funding bodies. So if you think about that, you can then see why the particular perspective of the business in terms of what it's making available is affected by factors that it needs to be able to justify and actually make a business case for funding that. So that's why for business archives, it's a bit different. They're going to make available what they think is going to be of value to the business to some extent. And I think even for, if you take archives across the board, so business archives that are held in other repositories, a lot of funding is still coming from that organisation. I've got some figure of 80% in my head or something like that. So even allowing for that, most funding is not coming from, say, the Heritage Lottery Fund or the Museums Association or National Archive or all those other people. I mean, it's important. Those sources are important, but actually a lot of it is internally generated. So for business archivists, it's actually about persuading your business to actually support your archive in particular ways. I don't know if that helps, but...
The RGS is a charity, and most of our core work is funded by our charitable work. So the Society's income really comes from three major sources, one of which is membership, one of which is letting of the building, and the third one of which is all of the other activities that we do, from scholarly publishing through to running of events. And that's what supports the core work of the Society, the staff in the Royal Reading Room, the basic stuff. In terms of the project works on top of that, it comes from the sources I'm sure you already know. It's Heritage Lottery Fund, and increasingly the AHRC, although some of the other research councils have been supportive too. So I'm afraid I don't have any good answers to your question.
I think there should be a lot more collaboration between academics and collections, yes. I think that's definitely the way forward in the university sector. I've been struggling recently to find funding. I've been with the University of Cambridge now for 13 years between the two jobs. And we get a lot of our money, it's all small grants, it's putting lots of little projects together and matching funding from different donor organisations. And 13 years ago, the income people were getting on investments was much higher, interest rates were higher, I assume it was. And now most of those charitable organisations I go to looking for funds, they can perhaps give me £1,000 a year. Go back 13 years, I was getting £15,000 a year from them, and I could do a lot more with it then. And when you're trying to fund posts, it's very difficult, so I'm relying more and more on volunteers to do digitisation projects, which isn't good. I did apply for just funding. Sadly, I didn't get it for a big photograph project, which would have enabled us to have done so much more than we have. But yeah, it's juggling, approaching lots of small charitable trusts, then matching what you can get from one against another. And it's very difficult. My own post is partly funded by the Smuts Fund, hence my post name. So even I'm only I'm not fully funded by the university either. I'm partly funded by a trust fund. So it's really difficult. I don't know if you have any more answers. No.
Can I just I'll just say something else as well, which is that, in fact, some businesses have actually got collaborative doctoral awards. So I know that, for instance, the Rothschild Archive has worked with King's College on some CDAs, and those can work quite well. But something that bugs archivists a bit is that quite often, and this goes back to we do need to collaborate a bit more, and it also ties in with the question about the relationship between archivists and users. There have been a number of sort of research applications in the past where historians have said, we're going to use these archives, and they haven't actually even approached the archives to find out whether that's possible. And it sounds amazing, but it does occur quite frequently. So I think I'm making a plug to, talk to the archivists. The historians and archivists need to get together and actually collaborate a bit more. Thanks.
We've only got a few minutes left, so if you've got an urgent question, just wave at me now. I'll know how many we've got to try and squeeze in.
Thank you very much. Janet McCalman from the University of Melbourne. I was wondering how we think about privacy in terms of the Global Archive. As all jurisdictions have their own rules, we're afflicted in Australia with being a federation with having effectively 8 different jurisdictions about standards of privacy and access to material. And also in terms of the former Commonwealth or the former Empire, differences in expectations between different cultural groups. In Australia, Indigenous people find it very offensive to have images of deceased persons publicly displayed. Is that going to be observed by archives and museums outside Australia who are unaware of those sensitivities? And finally, we've had the problem with, as we're increasingly linking things, small pieces of information about individuals which are exciting for family historians, when linked together can become much more ominous and an intrusion on a family's privacy. And we've actually had a lot of complaints from the public towards, say, the National Library of Australia's wonderful program of digitising now more than 400 historical newspapers. And now the skeletons of the family cupboard, which were extremely difficult to discover if you had to go through the print versions, can be easily found. And so people have been requesting that sections of newspapers be removed from the digital archive, as they have been asking that sections of their digitised military records that mention great-grandfather's syphilis be also removed from the archive. Now, I just wondered what your thoughts about how we manage this at a global level.
Well, the first thing to say is that trying to police anything on the internet is virtually impossible. So you've got to think very carefully before you actually make anything available online. You've got to think about all sensitivities. And bearing that in mind, and I can only speak from the Bank of England perspective, we are ultra cautious about what we make available online. So even material that is actually open to researchers in person, we have to go through and in effect have a complete different set of sensitivities for material that's going online for the first time. In effect, it's treated like it's not been available before. So, I mean, I think it's incredibly important, but it is going to be really difficult to police.
Yes, it's very challenging with colonial archives. We have families who approach us, again, about this sensitive information. And very often, families don't know what's been donated to the RCS collections by former generations. There's usually a 2-generation gap, and people are discovering about their grandparents and what happened. People write histories. Also, families fall out. Different branches of families don't speak to each other, and I find that. I hear from both sides often to do with an archive. So families get together as well. It can be a positive thing, and hopefully I sometimes succeed there. It's not easy. We've been very careful, firstly, in terms of copyright, what images we put out and what we put on loan. We have a university copyright officer who gives me pages and pages and pages of information I have to read through, and we're very closely with him. We're not allowed to take much risk. The university's risk level is very low. So I mean low or high, whatever it is. But anyway, I have to be incredibly careful because they're not prepared to pay out money if somebody does take us to court. So we are very cautious in what we've put out in terms of copyright. Yes, in terms of cultural, what's the word, cultural norms, sensitivities around the world. I have to try and be aware of them. I may not know about them all, I accept that point, and that could be an issue. But we also have disclaimers on all our images we put up, saying we'll remove an image if anyone approaches us and explains why it shouldn't be there. So we do put that up in a disclaimer. Unfortunately, our disclaimers are quite large, and about 4 pages of disclaimers if you go into our photograph gallery, and you have to have a legal officer at the university insist people read all 4 pages. Well, I'm sure they don't. I'm sure they press next, 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 but they are there. So we are trying to be careful and cautious. But I have had contact with families. We haven't yet had to withdraw anything. We've digitised. But we have had open debates and had different branches of families approach me on the same issue. So yes, it is a big issue.
No, just very briefly, that's very interesting. I mean, the only thing I'd kind of add is that in a sense, it shouldn't mean that we stop putting things online. Rather, it should encourage us to sort of work collaboratively with groups and with communities elsewhere in order to understand different sort of expectations, really, in relation to colonial archives and images. So I guess it should not sort of send us in a different direction and being more kind of restrictive in relation to what we put online. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's somebody on Twitter who just said, talking about copyright and freedom of information and access this close to lunch is brave. I think it's also brave because the drilling is starting again. So we'll wind up there. Thank you very much to our speakers who've got us off to such a great start. And it's now time for lunch.
Yes, lunch is served outside, everyone. Can I just apologise on the behalf of the university, over which I have no control, for the intrusive noises? I don't think they're starting again. That may be something we can nip in the bud. But particular thanks and apologies to Catherine, who showed the resilience for which her organisation is famed in talking through it. And I do apologise and hope you will accept our lunch as some kind of recompense. Thank you all very much.